So it is my great pleasure to welcome our speaker, Christina Rodenbeck. Now, I sense most of us in the room know Christina, but for those who are new to her, we have a wonderful evening of astrology in store. Christina, who has clients all around the world, also runs a renowned blog called The Oxford Astrologer, and we're putting a web link to that in our chat box right now. As well as that, many of us know and highly value the monthly podcast that Christina does with Sally Kirkman. They take a deep dive into upcoming transits on a monthly basis, and they provide a really useful roadmap through time. Christina has been writing the fashion column for the Astrological Association's journal for several years, and she's also a tutor on the faculty of the Nodor School of Astrology in Beijing, where the ISAR curriculum is taught. She teaches the core curriculum there, along with Lynn Bell, Adrian Duncan, and David Rayleigh. And in fact, she's just finished teaching an 8-week course, she tells me, on the asteroids, and she thinks that's the first time a course of that type has been taught as far as she is aware. But turning to her lecture here and now. Now, Christina had said to me that doing this talk for us tonight has helped her focus on one of her great loves, and that is mundane astrology. And in this talk, we are going to consider the question, where the hell are we now? Now, I can remember talking with Christina about the title for our talk for this session, and we just had an intuitive sense that it would make sense by this moment in time. So, Christina, were we right?
Yes, I think we were right to ask that question. And to think that we might have, I mean, I don't know, where are we now? Let's find out. So without more ado, I'm going to put up my little slideshow and we'll see if we can figure something out or not. Well, I'm really glad to be here, and I'm glad so many people have turned up. As you know, astrology is really complex, and sometimes we can get really sucked into the tiny details and not look up and look at the bigger picture. So I thought when I was putting together this talk, first of all, it's only an hour, so I've got to be pretty quick. But I thought that I would try and disentangle everything and talk about the planets from the furthest out inwards and really just concentrate on the outer planets, because we're talking about collective astrology here, the collective, what's happening to the collective. And of course the inner planets are important for that, but really I'm talking about where are we in this era? And that's kind of the question that I gave myself. So first of all, I wanted to just remind you of the cycles, how different the orbital cycles are of the planets, right? So we have Eris, which is a really far out planet, which takes 559 years to go around the sun. And then we're going in towards Jupiter, which takes 12 years to go around the sun. So these are all long periods, but some periods are much longer than others. And of course, maybe you could think that the ones that are further out have less impact, but it doesn't really work that way in astrology, as we know. Actually, if anybody here has experienced a Pluto transit, you know Pluto is extremely powerful despite being a bajillion miles away. So I'm including Eris, which is a planet that I haven't worked with much before, but I actually had a little look last week. And you will see why I thought, my goodness, I better include Eris with this. And Eris takes about twice as long to go around the sun as Pluto. Okay, so I did this little graphic. What I also want you to see is the little arrows that I've done above, which are really important. So basically, I've shown you here that where we are right now, which is in 2021, we're in a long period of Eris, which actually goes from 1922 to 2044. We're in a long period of Capricorn, sorry, that was Eris and Aries. We're in a long period of Pluto and Capricorn, which started in 2008 and finishes in 2023. We're coming to the end of a period of Neptune and Pisces. We're right in the middle of Uranus and Taurus, pretty much. Actually, maybe more near the beginning. We're in the middle of Saturn and Aquarius, and we're at the end of Jupiter and Aquarius. Plus, we're in the midst of Chiron as well. So that's actually where we are in terms of what the planets are doing. And if you look at this little chart on the left, transits of 7th of October 2021, which is kind of now, you can see that all of those outer planets, I've taken out all of the inner planets, but all of the outer planets are in that top and that quarter of the chart. So they're in between Jupiter and Uranus, essentially. I've kept in the nodes because I think they're important, but they're in between Jupiter and Uranus, sorry, Pluto and Uranus in those Earth signs, right? And so they're just in that sector of the sky. And sometimes, I mean, you can look back and you can see that when you have a weight of outer planets in one sector of the sky, it's sort of lopsided. So we're in a slightly lopsided time. And you can also see that it runs from the midwinter, the winter sign of Capricorn. Sorry, Australians, but you know, the summer sign of Capricorn, but you know what I mean. The winter sign of Capricorn to the spring sign of Taurus. So we're at the end of the zodiac, coming into the beginning of the zodiac with these outer planets. We're going from endings into beginnings. And we're at that crossover point where that's happening. So Pluto, Saturn, and Jupiter and Neptune are still at the end of the zodiac. They're still finishing stuff off. Whereas Uranus has run ahead and Chiron has run ahead, and they're all doing things in those early signs of the zodiac. So if we think about, if we think about where we are, and we look at that red line that I've drawn there, and we start with Eris. That's the kind of giant period that we're in, the larger period that we're in. And it's a way of orienting ourselves in time to do this. What does Eris mean, 1922 to 2044? And this is a big jumble of pictures, of course, but that's the period that Eris was. And having done a bit of work on her, I won't go into it too much, but I think that we can say that there is something about that, what that began in the 1920s, which is the modern world. It's modernity. So we're in the modern world. And here I have a picture of Charlie Chaplin in a factory. I have a feminist poster, the Beatles, blue jeans, a car. We've been in the age of the car since 1922. We've been in the age of popular music, recorded music. We've been in the age when women have started to have been more liberated. I mean, this has been an age of great liberation for women in many places. And we've been simply in the age of modernism. That's why I've put Clarice Lispector in there, who's a Brazilian writer, who's a very modernist writer, and the Bauhaus is a very modernist building. So in a way, the sort of aesthetics of this time are quite unified. It'll be interesting to see what happens in 2044. But from my looking back at Eris over the last, when she was in Aries the last time, she was in Aries the last time during the Renaissance. So it was, and I think that maybe when people look back, they will see that the 20th century had, despite its horrors and everything, was an amazing Renaissance in terms of ideas and art, etc. So I'm wondering also, after having actually looked into Eris, whether we've misinterpreted that planet quite a lot because of her discord. And I would suggest that actually Eris is less about discord and more about disruption. So it's a disruptive, we're living in a period where these disruptions produce creativity. Yeah, and that's been happening since 1922, essentially. And that's the overarching behind thing with where we are. Above thing, behind thing. Okay, this is less pleasant, but here we are also in the era of Pluto and Capricorn, and I'm sure you recognize Jeff Bezos laughing at us with his 200 billion. He's just become the first man in the world to earn 200 billion, to be worth $200 billion, which just is incredible when you consider that I think that's the GDP. Is it the GDP of the entire planet put together? I mean, the GDP of the States is like 20 billion or something. Anyway, I haven't got the numbers to hand. It's a lot of money. And what we've seen since 2008, 2023, the reason I put the Lehman Brothers up there is to remind you that what happened at the beginning of Pluto's entry into Capricorn, which we should always look at when we're trying to understand what the meaning of an outer planet in a certain sign is, was the collapse of the banking industry, theoretically, but then it was rescued again very quickly. But it was the banks coming apart. And Pluto, of course, is the lord of wealth. He's associated with wealth capital, not with money, which is the realm of Venus, but Pluto controls assets, whereas Venus kind of goes shopping. So Plauton means wealth in Greek. And that's why we talk about rule by a wealthy elite when we talk about a plutocracy. So the capitalist system under which most of us live was born sometime around 500 years ago in the early modern period. But it really started to kick off with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution about 240 years ago. Now, the reason I mention these two periods is because these were previous periods when Pluto was in Capricorn, okay? So it seems to, Pluto and Capricorn connects very closely to capitalism. Last time Pluto was in Capricorn was, of course, in the 1770s. And there were some important switches. There were important switches of ownership at that time in the world of hegemony. So America won independence, of course. We all know that America's Pluto return is coming up. But meanwhile, India and China had the reverse happen. And here's a really interesting kind of parallel to our own times, which is the British East India Company in the 1770s was a private enterprise that was so powerful that it's had its own army, its own ports, and eventually its own states in India. In 1772, Warren Hastings, who was a poor boy who worked his way up through the ranks of the company, became the first governor of Bengal. He was appointed by the crown. So the crown started to take over the East India Company. Or rather, the private company became an arm of the British crown. And it got a corner on opium grown in Bengal and began smuggling it to China. This led to an epidemic of drug addiction in China, and eventually into China's forced entry into trade agreements with the West. And India would be under the British yoke until 1947, which you'll see is actually quite a significant date in the periods I'm looking at. Now, why do I mention this? It's because this is a transnational company, which is more powerful than a country, which is quite interestingly similar to certain companies that we know today, Amazon, Facebook, blah, blah, blah. They're all bigger, they're not just, they're bigger than most countries, than all countries. I think Facebook is the same as Amazon, and that it's actually got he's richer than most countries' GDP. So here I've also got a picture of General Sisi, the president of Egypt, just to remind us, and of course of Vladimir Putin. And Bezos. I'm sorry, it's all men, but that's how it turned out. And why have I included these people? These are people who have thrived a lot during this Pluto in Capricorn period. And of course, Jeff Bezos is the Ur Capricorn. He's a Capricorn himself. Vladimir Putin actually has Pluto on his MC, if we're to believe his chart, of course, which I don't know. Sisi, I haven't checked, But it's interesting that he came to power at the beginning of this period and has just become incredibly rich. Certain parts of Egyptian society have become incredibly rich during this time. So I think that we can say some things about Pluto and Capricorn, just thinking about this, which is Pluto is about, it's about power, and it's about money. And we're seeing this massive, we've seen a big shift in global power into the hands of these private corporations. And we've also seen a shift of money into the hands of the 1%. So for example, in the last 15 years, there's been a much gap between the very, very rich and the rest of us has increased greatly. So I just want to mention the French economist Thomas Piketty, who I kind of like. He's shown that assets generate more money at the moment than labor. In other words, owning a flat is going to earn you a better income than making something and selling it. Since making something and selling it is the engine of traditional capitalism, this is actually proving to be something of a problem. So you end up with a rentier economy, which is the economy that is landlord's economy. And that's what led up to the French Revolution. And the reason I mention this is also because in this Pluto in Capricorn, the last time Pluto was in Capricorn, was just before the French Revolution. And the revolutionaries were all the people born with Pluto in Sagittarius, who is generations who are the Zoomers now. So Gen Z are the Pluto and Sagittarius people. And the last time we had that cohort of people, they were French revolutionaries, among other things. Not everybody was a French revolutionary, but you get the idea that actually we've got to a stage where a lot of wealth is concentrated in the hands of wealth, and power is concentrated in the hands of an elite. And that seems to have happened with Pluto and Capricorn. Of course, there are a couple of things I want to mention, which is the square to Uranus, which was very dramatic when it happened back in 2015-16, and also the conjunction to Saturn, but we'll come to those later. Let's hope this works this time. Oh. So I just wanted to mention that at the same time that you have all that concentration of power, there's a power struggle going on. And part of that was the Uranus-Pluto square. So Uranus was in Aries until 2018 for 7 years. And during that time, it was a time of massive demonstrations by the individual. So this is Tahrir Square in the middle. This is the umbrella movement in Hong Kong. This is Extinction Rebellion, which has come afterwards, but it's still a pushback against this Pluto and Capricorn. The Pink Pussy ladies, Black Lives Matter, and in France, the Gilets Jaunes. So we've had the pushback against this concentration of power, and that's to do partly with Uranus and how Uranus has responded to what was happening. But one of the features of all of these movements, actually less so with the Hong Kong one, because there is Joshua Wong, but I'll just mention that, but they didn't really have leadership. And in fact, a lack of leadership also seems to be part of the Pluto and Capricorn time, because the people who've really stuck it out and really done well are those sort of guys that we just saw, who are actually quite behind the scenes guys in a way. Everybody else has come and gone. All these other world leaders have come and gone, but they're hanging in there. Joshua Wong is the leader of the Hong Kong resistance, who is very young. He's a Pluto and Sagittarius person. I can't remember how old he is, 21 or something. But aside from that, there's been, it's either been group or leadership, but there's no one person who's come to the head of these things. And I think that's quite an interesting feature, because if you think about what Pluto is wears the invisible helmet, right? He's the unseen figure, the unseen, what's that Sherlock Holmes story? The Hidden Hand. It's the hidden hand. It's the hidden person. And it's interesting also that mask wearing, or the wearing of masks, the hiding of faces, it didn't start with the masks that we're wearing now. It started way back in 2008, 2009, 2010 with the those Occupy masks, and with those, with the, not the Taliban, the Al-Qaeda, where, you know, those hooded figures. So we've had a lot of those hooded figures and those hidden faces in this decade, just as a sort of symbol of where of hidden power. So yeah, okay, I'm going to stop there with masks, or I could go on forever. Okay, now this is interesting, I think, which is that we're actually, one of the first things that I because I was looking at Eris, or it was the other way around, I was looking at Eris because of this talk, and I realized that actually in 2 days' time, we're about to have the final square between Pluto and Eris. And who is Eris? She is this goddess of discord, and she's a disruptor. She changes things. And actually, we're at the end of all of these: 26th of January, 14th of June, 10th of December. So this is like the 5th time that they squared. And the first thing many of you will notice is, oh, 26th of January, 2020. That was when this whole pandemic thing started. I'm not saying that it's just Eris, but she definitely is in there. And what's interesting about this is I look back to where these two powerful outer planets, these are the two furthest out planets. They're about the same size. She's twice as far out as him. When they last made a square. And it doesn't happen very often, obviously, because they both move so very slowly. And for any person familiar with the works of Hilary Mantel, or with Tudor history, English history, for the years 1534, 1535 ring a strong and powerful bell, because these are the years that Henry VIII, he married Anne Boleyn in 1534, declared himself head of the Church of England, and then he killed her in 1535. I think it was the end of 1535 or 1536. Anyway, boom, that marriage happened. And this country, Britain, went a separate way from the rest of Europe. And it was disruptive. And that is very Eris, to do something that's very disruptive and different. If you go to my website, I have written an article about this, and there's some really nice parts to the Eris thing, because she acts as a disruptor in the arts as well. And actually, some of the most amazing artworks are produced during these squares, about which we may know nothing at the moment. You know, we may look back in 15 years and it may turn out to be someone in a garret in, you know, Ouagadougou who's made this incredible artwork. So that was 1534, 35, and that's quite an amazing, important and potent couple of years, at least for this country. But that disruptive act, because the king wanted to bed this woman, he changed the law, he changed the world, and his choice to do that. And of course, he wanted to take all the money from the monasteries, right? So that's Pluto, isn't it? It's that wealth. He wanted that wealth. He took the wealth. But that had a rippling repercussion through history, because of course, by taking that wealth, created, you know, and then does that lead directly to colonialism? Does it, you know, history, it changes the course of history, okay? Things that happen in this little corner with this Pluto squaring Eris, the history changes course. You might ask 1907 to 1911, you know, what was happening then? And it was interesting actually to look at that. And of course, it's the suffragette movement was huge then. It was also really, really important artistically. It's an incredibly important few years in terms of the Ballet Russe, and Picasso starts Cubism. So it's the beginning of modernism. which of course, bursts forth when Eris moves into Aries, but those beginnings are just there. The rupture, the break with the past, the different way of thinking. And both of these periods, if I looked at them closely, or seem to be points where people start to look at things differently. Suddenly they see the world differently. They see the world with new eyes. And you really get that with, and it's interesting because in that first period, the Renaissance, which is the 1534, Eris is still in Aries, so it's not that different from now. And in fact, that period of that Tudor period, we know already has a lot of resonance with today. Okay. 12th of January, 2020. I need to mention this because, of course, if you look at this is the important pileup of planets that we had. It's a huge conjunction. It's one of the two really significant things that happened in 2020. And we talked about it a lot at the time. There's a huge pileup of planets. It's getting the square exactly from Eris, of course. And it's the beginning of the Saturn and Pluto cycle, a new Saturn-Pluto cycle. And this is really important. It's an important cycle. It's an important political cycle. And the Saturn-Pluto cycle, if I mention these dates to you, they probably will mean something, because Saturn and Pluto meet every 30 or so years. So in the last century, they met in 1914, 1947, 1982, and then 2020. So 1914, I think, needs no explaining what happened then. In 1947, that is the birth of Pakistan, India, and Israel, which are all, of course, nuclear states, but they're also all states which have, are states which cause with great, which have never stopped fighting, I guess you could say. These are warrior states, all of them. And it's also the birth of the Truman Doctrine, which was the Cold War doctrine in 1947. Then we get to 1982, we get the conjunction again, the Cold War comes to an end with the death of Brezhnev, and we start moving into a new period. So we're in a period between 1982 and 2020 of that Saturn. We've just been through that period, okay? And now we're into a new one. This Saturn-Pluto cycle, and of course, this is the pandemic started a few weeks later, a few weeks after this, right? But I wanted to mention that I think China is really interesting in this, in that it's very connected to the Saturn-Pluto cycle. So 1947, the Constitution of the People's Republic went into effect. And then, so you have halfway points between this, right? So anybody born in the mid-60s will have Saturn opposite to Pluto, right? Or anybody born in 2002 will have Saturn opposite to Pluto. And you'll find in your own chart, if you have any connection to if Saturn and Pluto have any connection in your chart, whether that's an opposition, trine, square, whatever, this cycle will really affect you. So it's worth looking and paying attention to whether they make a connection in your chart. And if you have, then this is a new beginning. So anybody born in 1966 will have felt this conjunction very strongly and will be definitely on a new period of their life. So for example, China is interesting. So 1947, the Constitution went into effect. 1966, there's the Cultural Revolution, when everybody was, all the intellectuals were sent off to work camps, and it was just horrible. Then 1982 is when they start this capitalist experiment that they're still doing. And 2002, they join the World Trade Organization. And now we're in 2020, and we'll see, what is China doing now? China is exercising, it's flexing its muscles, and it's been from 1982 to now, China has been in continuous growth, continuous exponential growth. So just keep that in mind. So we can come back to this chart at the end for a discussion, but there's quite a lot to get through this evening. But this chart, this moment of the 12th of January, 2020, is the moment when we turn a corner. We turn a corner into a new time. Because look at that. That is all of those planets piling up in Capricorn, the sign of cardinal Earth. And of course, one of the big things that we want to, that's, the biggest story of now is really climate change and the state of our Earth. And it's interesting to me that within this massive conjunction, which, we're still experiencing, so we're just at the very beginning of the Saturn-Pluto cycle, because the next time isn't for another 30 years when they meet again. So we're at the beginning of this little cycle and we need to make these changes, obviously, but this cycle began with Ceres, the goddess of abundance, the goddess of agriculture, right in the heart of that conjunction. So it's not a single conjunction, it's a triple conjunction, actually, that we had on that day, plus sandwiched by the Sun and Mercury and Jupiter's in there just for good measure, in case we didn't get the point that about, well, there's various things in here, but it's a question of who's in power. Okay. I know you want to see this man because he's such an idiot. Uranus and Taurus has been in Taurus since 2018 to 2025. Now, aside from the horn guy, who is the guy from the Capitol riot on January 6th, actually, there's a lot of really good stuff about Uranus and Taurus, okay? This is innovation. This is the way forward. So we have Uranus, which is the planet of invention, in Taurus, the sign of let's get practical. It's an earth sign. It's also by sign trine to Pluto and Capricorn. Now, so they're no longer at odds. They're actually trining each other, which is helpful, right? So we may get some solutions. So that's why we have, renewable energy. We have this is the Chloe spring summer collection, which is completely recycled. And we're going to have more and more AI. It's also about making stronger networks, because Uranus is also, it's about the network, it's about computers, it's about the internet, it's about how we connect. And we may be connecting more via this way and less, and more electronically and less in actuality. I'll get more to that in a minute. And of course, the obvious one is cryptocurrency as well, Bitcoin, blah, 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 whichever cryptocurrency it is, and the cashless society. And unfortunately, I think we are going in that direction. I think, we will be seeing less and less cash and more electronic stuff. And the big problem for people is going to be security. How do we keep this stuff secure? And we're going to have a big problem with this next year, I think, when Jupiter goes into Pisces and makes a conjunction with Neptune, that there's a danger of really, really big frauds going on with that. I mean, I love Jupiter in Pisces, I love Neptune in Pisces, but there's a lying side to that and a cheating side to that, which is quite worrying when you see it with all of us going over to crypto. And then there's this guy. Okay, so that's all the upside. Like I said, Uranus and Taurus actually got this incredibly positive feel about it, actually, of potential and looking to the future. And this is in one of the spring signs. So this is not about endings. This is about the future and beginnings. You know how I said at the beginning, we have these things, some of the outer planets are going into these spring signs. But we also have this fella here who's problematical. And I've been reading quite a lot recently about New Age, very right-wing New Age stuff. And, you know, people having their own ideas about how things work and being very kind of stubborn about it. Anyway, which brings us to the Capitol riot, which I think is a really important inflection point last year, or not last year, was it this year? Oh my God. Well, anyway, you can see why I bring that up with Uranus and Taurus, because Uranus and Taurus was making an exact square to Saturn and Jupiter at that point in Aquarius. And so Uranus and Taurus had been there for a while. Saturn and Jupiter came along, made the square. Why do I mention this? Well, Uranus is also about having crazy ideas sometimes. And it's about individualism. It's, you know, wanting to go your own way, you know, do your own thing. And it butts up against Saturn and Jupiter in Aquarius. So what is Aquarius? It is the house of the people, which is the capital. And what is Jupiter? It's the lawmaker. So you have Uranus furious against the lawmaker and the establishment, which is Saturnian. And these things, they came to a big clash on that day. Mind you, I think that these guys are going to, well, we'll see what happens. And you can see also that Jupiter was square and Saturn was square. Right. Which brings us to the Saturn and Uranus, Saturn and Jupiter in Aquarius. And I think that's a Russian priest. I thought it was quite nice for Jupiter in Aquarius on top of a mountain. And these two are both in Aquarius. Now, that is where we are right now. We're at a time when Saturn and Jupiter are both in Aquarius, which is the sign of connections, of community, of it's the sign of the engineer. It's the sign of canals and networks and thought waves. And both of the big planets are in there. It's interesting. So they're the mightiest planets known to the ancients were Jupiter and Saturn. They were so close together at this grand conjunction on the December 21st, 2020. Did I put December 23rd there? I think I may have. So that sight of seeing those two planets in that part of the sky had last been witnessed during the final years of Genghis Khan. Okay, so that's how far back we have to go to get some historical parallel with that incredible sight. I hope everybody had a chance to see it, because it was extraordinary, because they were really close. So in that year, you know, this is the year the Cathars in the south of France were completely crushed. 7-year-old became the shogun in Japan. And the Temple of the Smiling Buddhas was under construction. That's how long it was ago. It was 8 centuries ago. This great conjunction is a very familiar cycle to astrologers, okay? And it was a familiar cycle to astrologers a long, long time ago. We've always been looking at this great conjunction. Some people argue that this is what the Magi saw when they were looking for Jesus. It was associated with the rise and fall of kings and emperors. And it happens every 20 years, okay? But this is a special one. And every 20 years, it does open a generational kind of period. It's a turning point. So this one was special, though, because It was the first one in air since 1802, except for one in Libra in 1980. Okay, so since 1802, we've pretty much had all of our grand conjunctions every 20 years, with a couple of exceptions, have been in the earth signs. And you could say, well, it's been a very earthy, materialistic sign. Jupiter and Saturn are both concerned with society and how we live together as human beings. Both of them are teachers, judges, gurus. They're both planets of law and rules in different ways. Jupiter is the generous ruler and Saturn is the disciplined ruler. That's why the conjunction affects everybody in society. And that's why it makes this generational change. Both the conjunctions that we've had previously in 1980 and in 2000. So the one in 1980 was that exceptional air one, was in Libra, and the one in 2000 was in Taurus. Both of those were ruled by Venus, which is the planet of cash and beauty and art and culture and social niceties and sugar and indulgence and luxury and everything sweet like that. But excessive Venus can be quite decadent. And I think that we may have been going through a very decadent period for the last 40 years since 1980, a period of voracious consumption, while those great conjunctions were ruled by Venus. And of course, this one is not ruled by Venus. It's got a completely different feel already. It took place in Aquarius, the air sign. So we're starting on this massive air cycle, which is going to take us through a couple of hundred years, I think. I've got the date somewhere. And this is just the first bit of it. But it's also ruled by Saturn. So it's much more serious, into a more serious time. It may be a time of restriction, for example. So we've gone through this time of luxury, and now it's a time of restriction. Now, I hasten to add that people in many parts of the world did not experience the last 40 years as decadent, okay? So I just put that there. However, in many parts of the world, it has been decadent, and certainly consumer capitalism itself has become the religion of our times. So we'll see what happens with this Saturnian grand conjunction. And it's important when you look at these conjunctions to see what planet is actually the ruler in that conjunction. So Saturn's on top here. Now, the other thing about this conjunction that's really important was that it was at 0 degrees of Aquarius. So that's very much telling us this is the beginning. We're right at the very, very beginning of a new period, of a new age, of something new. And I think that we should feel reasonably optimistic, but I don't think that this is telling us that it's going to be easy, that we're just going to slide right into it. It's going to take work. It's going to take probably cooperation as well, which doesn't sit well with some of the kind of more Uranian stuff. And of course, what's interesting is we have the conjunction and we should be feeling all optimistic. And then we get an airborne pandemic comes immediately afterwards, right? So we have the conjunction and then like 2 months later, there's this airborne pandemic. So here we are in where we are now. We're in this Saturn, Jupiter conjunction-y Aquarius time in this year that has been dominated by air, where every Mercury retrograde this year, it has been in air, so Mercury's been in air most of the time. So it's been a very, very air year. And what is air? Air is about, the air signs are society. They're about communications. And of course, Saturn is putting a stop to certain things. I love this woman who is from the cover of the New Yorker, because I think this picture describes exactly how what it is like to be home working, right? So she's got her top on, like same as me, and her shorts on the bottom. She's got her martini and her earrings. And then everything else is like, the floor is disgusting. Whatever is behind her bed, I don't know. But she's got that screen behind her. And we've all learned to live in this place of greater isolation, which is very Saturnian, to be isolated, to be withdrawn. Now, just before I started this talk, one of the people here was talking about depression, which is a Saturnian thing. Well, in some ways, it's been quite, I wouldn't say it's been a depressing time, because it hasn't necessarily for some people, but it's been an isolating time. And of course, introverts have loved it and extroverts have been, desperate. But if we think of Aquarius also as I was saying, these networks, we're having real problems with those now. Saturn is going to be in this part of the sky for quite a while, until 2023. And we're already experiencing fuel shortages. We're experiencing problems with container ships. This is really, really serious. All these sailors just don't want to do it anymore. They've been stuck on board for 18 months and they go home, they don't come back on board. We're experiencing, and in this country, we've done ourselves a special favor by adding Brexit on top of a pandemic, so that we have a really serious problem with supply lines. And that seems to me very Aquarian, to be talking about the supply lines and the question you have to ask yourself. I speak to a lot of people who work in publishing, right? And most printing used to be done, well, in Oxford, it used to be done in Oxford. There's whole sections of this town that were for printing. And then it was done, then it moved out to, I don't know where, other places in England. And then it moved to Spain and Germany. And then printing moved to Singapore. And now it's mainly done in China. Well, if you have your printing done in China and your container ships aren't going, you're actually in real trouble. So we've allowed, like Napoleon invading Russia, we've allowed our supply lines to get too long. The whole world has. And they're being snipped by, or made to be more rationalized by Saturn. So I don't think that this supply problem is going to just vanish, because we've all become, our consumer capitalism, what with fast fashion and everything quick, has become used to this just-in-time delivery, this just-in-time system. Well, that just-in-time system isn't going to work if at the moment. And the other thing that, of course, that is very Saturn and Jupiter in Aquarius is this idea of social distancing and having to keep our distance because of this illness that is going around. The illness is more to do with other things, I think, but the response to the illness, which is all the millions of rules that we have to follow, like if you want to go anywhere, all the tests that you have to take, etc. And the not they're being applied very rationally, but that's another story. And the planes being grounded. So a lot of transportation, there are a lot of transportation problems. And this is all about connections and networks. Meanwhile, however, we're all getting used to working on Zoom. So Aquarius 7 is a really amazing example of this. I used to have to get in my car and drive to Cheltenham to come see you. Well, no longer, we're doing it online, and we've got a lot more people here, and it's actually great. Congratulations for doing this. But this is something that is changing, and some networks are getting stronger, and we're able to have this global reach, and some are breaking. And this will continue, I think, into 2023. I don't think that this is like just a flash in the pan, because it needs to be rethought. Okay. Right. Now, this is the other feature. So we've got, let's just rehash this, we've got Eris, we've got Pluto, we've got Uranus, we've got Saturn and Jupiter here, and then we've got Neptune in Pisces for a very long time. Now, I should have put Neptune higher up, but I actually think it's a different category of stuff going on with Neptune. And I better just catch up with my notes, because I'm just talking now. Okay. No boundaries, right? That's what Neptune in Pisces is, no boundaries. So we have this outer world, Saturn, in Aquarius, which is and Saturn, by the way, rules Aquarius, very strong in Aquarius, loves those rules, loves, creating rules and making up more rules and having more laws and having more legislation and doing more and more. But our inner world has become enormous and huge and vast and shared. This is Yayoi Kusama, an infinity room, a mirror room with a little iPhone at the end, which I put there, because of course, what we've all come to love, or I have anyway, since 2011 is the smartphone, and that is Neptune in Pisces. And I say that with absolute, it's so similar to what happened in the 1850s when Neptune was last in Pisces, when people discovered the sort of portable novel, is that you could read on the train or whatever, you could bury yourself in that. The book, and there were many very long books written at that point, great music, great writing. So what Neptune in Pisces does is it makes imagination boundless. It's given us Netflix and YouTube and TikTok and all of these social media things, which are wonderful and glamorous and beautiful and in our hands. Of course, there's a whole set of massive problems with that, because it's the opium of the people, isn't it? It's our opium. It's addictive. Everything Neptunian, everything Pisces is addictive. This is a sign of, where you get addicted to things. You become lured, and we're all lured into this imaginative space. Of course, there's also the opioid crisis, PS, and pharmaceutical crisis that is also part of the Neptune and Pisces thing, which is to get out of your head. And the other downside with Neptune and Pisces, because essentially I love it, but the downside is, of course, lies and lying, and the media lies, and the fact that we don't know what's true anymore because we're in a giant room made by Yayoi Kusama, right? We're in a hall of mirrors, which, PS, the hall of mirrors in Versailles was also created during a period of Neptune in Pisces, right? You probably know that famous hall of mirrors. So we're in the hall of mirrors, and this makes everything more complicated, more magical, and actually infinitely strange in some ways. We're here for a while longer, and my suggestion with this is to enjoy it, but know it for what it is, which is, it's an illusion partly, we're in a world of illusion. However, and that illusion has crept into the media that's supposed to be, we don't know what QAnon, all of that stuff, right? We don't know who to believe. This is the Neptune and Pisces, the hall of mirrors. And one of the sort of things that conspiracy theories are part of this. Conspiracy theory people always say, do your research. It's like, okay. It's hard to do research when you're in a hall of mirrors, because you don't know where you are. This is going to get even more so next year, because Jupiter is going to be in Pisces too. So I am expecting a fantastic arts, amazing music, wonderful good times in some ways, and some confusion next year. Also inflations, everything is going to, this is a sign where there's no boundaries, right? And it's the two planets with no boundaries are going to be in the sign with no boundaries. This hasn't happened since 1856, right? So, which was a year, the Second Opium War happened in that year, which is classic, even the name sounds right. And when Jupiter squared Neptune recently, that was when all these people walked from Syria. That was that year. So we can expect interesting things to happen next year. It's a moment of expansion, of artistic expansion or possibly over expansion. And it's going to be very hard. I mean, not hard, but it's going to be very spiritual for a lot of people. You know, this is a completely religious combination of planets. And in fact, in 1856, that was in the middle of a huge religious revival in the West. And of the beginning of the spiritualist movement, actually, was in the 1850s. But, well, we'll see what happens. But this is a really, really important thing. And the conjunction is in April next year. It's just once. But having both of those planets in Pisces expands the things that are Pisces. Oh yeah, so I did this picture too, just to emphasize my point, which is it's a big wave, and it's coming, and you know, so you need to get your surfboard, at least be prepared. Now I wanted just to say that the other really important another important thing that's happening next year is that America is actually having its Pluto return, although we had the precursor of this a couple of weeks ago at the Met Gala when Kim Kardashian wore that Pluto outfit. Where am I with that? Yeah. The Pluto return, well, not very many countries have experienced this because we keep on remaking the charts. But we can say that America was born in that crucible of Capricorn and Pluto, or you know, that industrial revolution time, that time of capitalism. And I have to say that there's going to be changes, and this is about who has power. I think there's a big power struggle going on, and I don't see that that is going to be stopping next year, where this Pluto return happens throughout the whole of 2022. And the reason it's important for the rest of us is because what happens in America affects the rest of the world. So I actually did think, well, the usual chart that we use for Britain is 1801, but I'm going to use the one for 1066. Okay, I'm going to speed up. I'm nearly done. I'm going to use the one for 1066 and have a look at that and see what that tells us about what happened when Britain had a Pluto return. England, not Britain. England had Pluto returns, which were in 1309, 1554, and 1799. And I have to say, it wasn't very good either to any of those times. So 1309 was like basically the beginning of a civil war under Edward II, Piers Gaveston, all that mess. And Edward was sort of forced by his boyfriend was murdered by the barons, and he was forced to make his own barons were against him. The Scots were against him and winning. The Welsh were revolting, and it was a mess. 1554 was another mess. It was the Wyatt Rebellion. Jane Grey was beheaded. Elizabeth was in prison, and Queen Mary married Philip, and they martyred these people down the road from where I live. So that was in the middle of Bloody Mary's reign. And finally, the last time this country had a Pluto return, interestingly enough, is when we changed the chart to the 1801 chart. And of course, it was England was at war with its other neighbors that time, with the French, with Napoleon. So it does look like a very messy period, if we take that as an example of what happens when a country has a Pluto return, of a period of power struggle. Who has the power? In Britain, the Pluto returns are in Pisces, so that has a whole religious side to it. So no wonder it was Bloody Mary, who was a Catholic. So that was the English Pluto return, which was in Pisces, but the American one is in Capricorn. So this is not about religion so much as about capital and money and power. So it's about who owns the wealth. That is where this Pluto struggle is going to be, is who's got the money. Right. Does that make sense? So I just wanted to reiterate or explain where we are in these big cycles. So we're in the second year of the Saturn-Pluto cycle, which is about 33 years. So that's that conjunction, right? We had the conjunction. Now we're moving away from that conjunction. We had the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, and now we're moving away from that conjunction. So these are two places where we're right at the very, 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 very beginning. And that Jupiter-Saturn one is the very beginning of that great conjunction, which is the Jupiter-Saturn one, is the very beginning of a huge 200-year. So basically, we're in a tiny baby beginning of something that we don't quite know. That's where we are. And finally, we're just past the Uranus-Pluto square, which we had in 2015, 2016, but we're moving towards a trine. And that's an important cycle as well, the Uranus-Pluto cycle. And it was very rough in that mid-period of 2015, 2016. That's when Trump was elected, you know, was in this period of turmoil. But we're moving to a trine, which is helpful. Okay. So these are just some dates, but the one that I really want to pick out is that in a few years' time, Pluto, let me go back. In a few years' time, Pluto will be at 0 degrees of Aquarius, right? So we had the grand conjunction at 0 degrees of Aquarius in that winter. And we're going to have Pluto come to that point and come back and forth over that point in a few years' time. By which point, Uranus will be in Gemini, and they will be making a very good trine to each other. Okay, that trine is really helpful, and it's in this social communications thing. The other important things are that Saturn is going to go into Pisces, but not till 2023. So next year, we have this amazing moment when the two rulers of Pisces are both in Pisces together, making it a very Pisces year. But Saturn is still in Aquarius in his own sign. And there's just some other dates of stuff that's happening. Just FYI. Okay. So just to go back, this is where we are. We're right at this stage at the very, and even Eris, by the way, will be changing signs in 2044, so that's not that far. But we're right at the stage where we're at the end of certain planets in certain signs. And we're moving into quite a new era because of this, the opening up into air. So we're at a point where things are messy. You know, it's not clear. The future is not clear. The future is definitely different from the past. And we turned a corner in 2020, and we're still not completely clear where we're going. But with these planets currently in Saturn, currently in Aquarius, especially Saturn and Aquarius, we're trying to build the highways into the future, build the ways in. And that is something that's really valuable. And what's helpful with that is that Uranus and Taurus helping us build our way into the future. And that, I think, is all I have to say for the time being.